Hi everyone and welcome back to another Sewer Oasis devlog. For those of you new to this series, this is devlog number 6 and Sewer Oasis is a Metroidvania game which I've been slowly chipping away at in my free time. It's been 3 weeks since the last devlog and I'm excited to share some of the changes I've made to the game. As you've probably guessed from the extremely obvious title and intro, I added a few enemies to the game. But before we get into making the actual enemies, let's go over some small changes and new systems I've added to the game. To help me visualize the world better, I made use of the world feature in the tiled editor and was even able to implement it in my game so that I could parse the file and determine what tile maps to load into the game, which I previously had been listing in a TOML data file. This world feature allowed me to easily align rooms and make sure that the world in my game made physical sense. Additionally, it was also a lot easier for me to actually create the levels. Next, I added a fade out transition between rooms to make transitioning more smooth. I also changed the attack animation of the player to a form which I thought was a lot more dynamic and satisfying to play with. And since some rooms don't really align with each other on the y-axis, I added camera zones which adjust the camera to seamlessly offset to the proper position so that we can switch rooms more logically. Additionally, camera zones can also be used to focus the camera on important parts of the room such as a platforming segment or at the start of a boss fight. There were a total of 2 enemies which I was able to squeeze into the game since the last devlog. Let's start off with the more complicated of the 2. I don't really have a name for this guy yet, but in the code he's just referred to as the blocker. Basically, he blocks the player from running through things carelessly, I guess. The main theory behind his attacks is that he shoots magic in 4 directions, either diagonally or in a straight fashion. The magic multiplies until it stops at a certain point, or it collides with the environment. In this first iteration, you can see that the attack works, but it is very unpolished because I didn't add any effects to it yet, and there's no telegraph to indicate when the attack disappears. So I added some particles, and after that, I added this green aura around it, which will hopefully make the player think that it's dangerous. It probably won't work, but I can always change it later. As a final touch, I created this electricity-esque sound effect for the magic attack, which I was able to find an easy method for creating from this forum online. It felt kind of embarrassing making whirring sounds with my mouth, but the sound effect isn't half bad in my opinion. Another piece of logic I kept in mind was to make this guy really annoying to kill. That way people will just ignore it and actually do what I intend by running through its attacks. There is a way to kill it, but it's too much trouble for people who aren't masochists. By standing in this blind spot, you can continuously strike the blocker until it dies. The health stat of this blocker is quite high though, so I don't think anyone will really try to do this too much. Alright, moving on to the second enemy of this devlog. This enemy also doesn't have an official name yet, but I referred to it as a golem. The main difficulty in creating this enemy was the pixel art because I had to manage a really high resolution and animate it on top of that. Needless to say, I definitely gained lots of experience when creating the pixel art for this enemy. For future enemies that have high resolution pixel art, I'll probably plan out the animation a lot more. Now the reason I said that the art was the hardest part of creating this enemy is because the behavior for this golem is very simple. All it does is pace around until it hits a wall or hits a ledge, at which point the golem will turn away and walk in the opposite direction. It might seem like a pointless enemy at first, until you realize that there is no way for the player to kill it at the moment and the hitbox is quite big. The reason that the player can't kill it is because the health is nearly unlimited currently. It is kind of intimidating that this enemy has near unlimited health, but some of you might be wondering why a big hitbox even matters. The main role which I have in mind for this golem is also to be a sort of blocker, just like the previous enemy, but for different types of terrain. The only way to get past the golem is to jump over it. And this is even harder when you're trying to move in the same direction that the golem is moving. This means that the golem can be an excellent obstacle in flat areas of the map. Another purpose which I'm going to use the golem for is to block off tunnels which the player should not have access to yet. Because there is no space for the player to jump over the golem in tunnels, the player is effectively denied entrance to an area until they can find a way to kill the golem. While I don't have any examples of this yet, I can definitely use the golem for this purpose in the future. I've always wanted to add heavy imposing footsteps to some sort of enemy in a game that I make, and today I'll have the chance. The golem seems more like a milk cow than something the player should be afraid of at the moment, so after hitting various objects on my table until I found a good sound, I'd say the golem definitely feels more intimidating now. It was at this time that I added spatial sound to the game. and I think the results of doing so are very noticeable with this golem and its footsteps. Also, since the blocker and the golem are in two different sections of the same room, you can kind of hear both of their sound effects when standing in these two sections. This is a good showcase of how spatial sound can create immersion, and it's also a signal for the player to realize that they were in the same room that they had been in previously. To finish off this enemy, I added an aura around the golem, which I might use for lore explanations in the future, such as the golem being an ancient creature that was reanimated and brought from the dead by some necromancy. So then I went around and placed enemies in areas where I thought it would make the game a bit more challenging. Generally, as mentioned prior, I placed the golems in flat areas, while blockers are put in general areas which the player can probably just run through easily without them there. If you time it right, you can also just run through the blockers, but for now I'll let it slide. After all, I'm pretty sure you can run through the entire current swamp area in a little under 3 minutes without any detours. On another note, I created this new room where you have to climb up to where there will ultimately be a boss fight. The player must display platforming prowess by timing their movements to when the blocker's magic attacks can't hit them. The climbing animation is kind of scuffed for now, but it will do for the current system. The next video will probably include me creating the boss fight for this area, so stay tuned for that one. Thank you guys for watching this far into the video. If you enjoyed the video or found it interesting, please like and subscribe. It helps motivate me to keep creating videos and to attempt to actually have an upload schedule. Peace.